Good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Amin. I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm going to briefly talk to you about cultural humility-informed care of Afghan refugees. We're going to specifically focus on Afghan refugees. However, first we should start with sort of global considerations when dealing with refugee population and refugee mental health. So first and foremost, whether you are a physician or a non-physician, remember the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so depending on where the individual is, whether it's refugee or otherwise, their hierarchy of needs may be in dyssynchrony compared to when you are offering mental health services. So first and foremost, the individual needs to be physiologically stable and be safe. And then from there on, this idea of love, belonging, self-esteem, and self-actualization becomes the realm of mental health. And you might touch point with the refugee at various different points, depending on where you're having your contact with them. And so this could be in an oppressed environment or in an empowered environment. So the sources of oppression would obviously be background and experiences in their home country, their flight and transition to their new country, and then the oppression can still continue due to acculturation, challenges, and discrimination that refugees often experience. And so the challenge for us, once those basic earlier needs are met, is getting the individual from oppression to empowerment. And there are roles for individuals, and then there's also community supports, and both can be very much therapeutic. And then the other aspect of this is interventional treating mental health problems as they arise, as well as working with populations in order to instill resilience. And so on this journey towards resiliency as well as intervention, one of the most important element is going to be the therapist and the patient relationship. The most important element is therapeutic alliance. And a therapeutic alliance requires building that trust, and that requires that you provide care that is filled with cultural humility. So what are some elements that you must keep in mind when dealing with Afghan population? Now, let me say this, that in Afghanistan there are over 30 languages and dialects, and there are numerous different heterogeneous populations. So some of these generalities are probably true across the board. However, you have to have the cultural humility and curiosity, and it all depends on whoever is in front of you. And so first and foremost, when approaching an individual from Afghanistan, especially a refugee, one of the cultural aspect in Afghanistan is that time tend to slow down. So in the Western culture, we tend to have sort of this sense of urgency. We're quick to jump into business, and that may not be ideal. So do spend that extra time collecting kind of minor and non-invasive, non-intrusive biographical information, getting to know them, where they're from, what language they speak, what part of the country they're from, what tribe they belong to, etc. And that curiosity is going to help you have a better therapeutic alliance rather than watching the clock, etc. And obviously, these have to be done within the constraints that we all face clinically. So spend that extra time in getting to know the patient. Another element in the culture is direct questions are considered rude. And so often culturally there is a circumferential element to inquiry. So for example, rather than asking someone, tell me about the explosion that took place and what that was like for you, which is highly sort of an individualized approach, rather asking them about, for example, I wonder what it's like to experience the level of danger that people experience in Afghanistan. And so one of the reasons why it's important to depersonalize these questions is that the culture has a huge element of shame and honor considerations. And so the individual may be afraid or uncomfortable with telling you that they were afraid, because they may not be quote unquote manly enough to admit to that. However, they might be willing to explain to you how other people may experience this as a scary or potentially life-threatening situation. So indirect questions are always better. Another piece to remember is that the culture is based on sort of spiritual meaning making, and so a lot of the things are seen through religious aperture. And most suffering is considered a test by God. So a lot of the Old Testament stories, like Job's suffering, is shared, and so there is a lot of fatalism. And so the goal in this supportive over explorative therapy would be to strengthen the individual patient's more mature defense mechanisms, such as altruism, talking about if you are talking to a parent, for example, who have made significant sacrifices in order to improve the lives of their children, talking about the altruistic aspect of that. Or if they have served and sacrificed for our troops, for example, serving as an interpreter, highlighting the altruistic elements in that and how they have been a force for good. Also assisting the individuals with enhancing suppression, which again is a significantly mature defense mechanism, and you can help the suppression by adding greater and greater layers of fate and the will of God. And so you may not necessarily have to be religious or even familiar with Islamic beliefs, but if you're able to add an element of fate and the will of God, that narrative and that meaning making is going to likely strengthen and the defense mechanism, especially of suppression. And so just remember that that therapeutic interventions do not just include psychotherapy. Another element in this sort of multi-phase model of psychotherapy for refugees is mental health education. And so education of any sort would be very welcoming and non-intrusive. So educating people on depression or anxiety or PTSD may be acceptable. Working with individual families, you have to consider that family dynamics are different, and there are significant differences in genders, gender equality, and so on. And so the dynamics may be different, and you just need to be very curious and ask for permission. And if you are going to propose group or family therapy, you should ask who should be in that group, ideally the parents if there are children involved. And they might want to have just the male children, or for the women, they might want to have just the women in the group, for example. And so that may be something that you're able to provide, and that would subsequently improve your therapeutic alliance with the patient. Remember that there are quite a few indigenous healing methods. One that comes to mind is in women, there tends to be a lot of somatic presentations of symptoms, and one cultural phenomenon that is prevalent in that culture, as well as in Pakistan, India, and throughout the subcontinent in South Asia, is this idea of genie possession. And so this can be seen from our sort of DSM lens as a conversion slash somatoform disorder. And in that sense, just have the family guide you in terms of some of the indigenous healing methods that they commonly use to help with those. Another piece you can do on the biopsychosocial, we are predominantly talking about psychological. Now on the social front, remember that understanding culture and being able to navigate a society is a form of capital. And so, for example, knowing how to call your representative is a type of power. Now for refugees, they do not have that. And one of the important things you can do is to provide resources that would enhance their cultural empowerment, i.e. how to navigate the immigration process, or how to ensure that they have connection to others in the community from similar culture. And then at higher level, in that biopsychosocial, again, talking about social elements, is social justice, human rights, and advocacy. So you may require to provide letters or other documentations related to their health that may be needed for immigration or other elements, and that's something that you could do in order to advocate for your patient. And so these are psychosocial element. And then finally, as long as you're able to have a strong therapeutic alliance, medications, including psychiatric medications, are acceptable within the culture, and you will just have to ensure that you let the consent with the patient. But often things like mental health may not be easily accessible, especially when it's translated. And so words like medicine for a weakened mind, for example, which is how it would translate in the Pashto language, for example, maybe some of the phrases that you might hear if you're using an interpreter, but the patients would be willing to accept psychotropics, assuming that they're able to have continuity of care. And then finally, being aware of other medical needs such as malnutrition, etc. That is something that for psychiatrists and other physicians, they'll have to keep in mind, including things like vitamin A deficiencies, vaccinations, and so on, would ensure good physical health, which obviously will translate into a comprehensive having their psychological needs met on that hierarchy of needs. And so ultimately, it is very difficult to translate an entire culture into a 15-minute video, but what would help you the most is just be curious, have humility, and when in doubt, ask your patients, and they'll educate you. I hope that you find this helpful. Feel free to give me feedback on anything that I might have missed.